Yeah, so this is a book I co-wrote with Christian Lammert, who's a professor of political science at Freie Universität. We've been working together for quite a bit, I mean, for the last 10 years or so. And we had written a book in 2017, just after Trump was elected and after the Brexit, which was then also translated into English, like this book by Suzanne Gillespie. And the title of the English version is Democracy in Crisis, the Neoliberal Roots of Popular Unrest. So we made an argument about how neoliberalism had sort of imploded and led to these effects that undermined democracy and in particular American democracy. And so what this new book is trying to do, the Legitimizing Authority book, is to try and take a step back and think about how this is not just about institutions that aren't working well or the media, so there are different explanations, for what we're facing right now, the kind of upheaval, but instead to say, well, we seem to be facing something bigger that is a crisis of legitimacy. And so we're trying to ask in this book what the mechanisms are through which a political regime is legitimate. And so basically we're trying to take this apart. Should also say that Christian is specialized on the social welfare state. And I have a slightly different take on state theory and more spatial processes and globalization. And so somehow our knowledge complements nicely. And that's why we've been working together like this. And so this book, the German version, I think came out 2 years ago as Das Versprechen der Gleichheit, the promise of equality, which made it into our subtitle for the English book. The original question was to ask, why are we seeing this crisis of liberal democracy across otherwise very different contexts? And how can we explain that? Media developments or technological innovation alone doesn't seem to do the trick. There seems to be something more fundamental at stake. And so basically what we've been arguing is that legitimacy can be provided in different ways and is somehow under attack in different ways. And the way we're making this point here is that to find a political regime legitimate, the idea of equality seems to be very important. So we don't, since the 17th century or so, we don't live in states anymore where you have a king and the king is put into place by God, by divine law, and this is what legitimizes his power. Instead, we've seen bourgeois revolutions and different kinds of processes in the West, but also around the globe, to try and make national states legitimate. And we identify 3 different dimensions of this. All start with an I, so that we can retain them. The first one is identity. So the first argument that many political thinkers made at the time and still are making today, I think it's very fundamental, is to say, well, the people who govern us should be the same as us. So this notion of equality, it's not someone who's put in place by dynasty or by God, but somebody who is somehow elected or put into that position through a procedure. So the notion that the governed are the same as those who govern. I think that's an essential idea that comes out of the Enlightenment. And this is very strongly related to this notion of equality, that we're rational individuals and we can, in principle, self-govern. This is the fundamental idea. It's this, this idea of equality. But the second dimension to this is institutions. It's not enough just to have someone who is of the same identity, a German or French person or what have you, but you need a set of institutions to make sure that power is actually checked. So how do you do that? You elect them and you make sure that after the next election, potentially they can also leave the stage, so that you have competitive parties who help also articulate political opinions. You have media, protection of individual rights, protection of minority rights, so a whole set of institutions that proliferate throughout the 18th and 19th century. Also certain capacities that you need as an individual. So it might not be sufficient for you to be able to vote, you also need a certain degree of education, for example, and a certain set of social rights. If you're just struggling for your survival, you might not be the best democratic citizen. So you have to be protected in certain ways. And states have provided this in the late 19th and early 20th century. So that's the second I, the second dimension. Next to identity is a set of institutions. And then what we're arguing is maybe a bit provocative. What we're saying is sometimes political regimes can also be legitimate, not just if they provide these institutions and satisfy these identitarian claims, they also create indifference. If people are indifferent because they can consume cheaply, for example, they have cheap goods coming in from somewhere else, or cheap credit, this keeps a system afloat, or can keep a system afloat. So a democracy, a liberal democracy, might function not because it has particularly good democratic citizens, but because it has satisfied customers, basically. And so what we're saying is that we seem to be hitting the limits of that regime because we're facing planetary boundaries. Not everyone can simply consume and be indifferent. And so this system seems to be hitting some limitations. I think that's a great question. I mean, I think it's a bigger social task. That's not just, it is also individual, I guess, for us to not just be consumers and passive and disgruntled as soon as our consumption choices aren't fulfilled, but also think about the public good. So I think we need something more than just rational value maximizers. Somehow we have to develop a sense of citizenship or of what it means to be a good citizen. So that there is an individual level to that, but of course, we also need systems that support that kind of thinking. So we need a certain type of education system. We need to, what has been called decommodification. So we need to take certain goods out of the market that are provided to citizens by virtue of them being citizens, rather than being provided through the private market. So I think there are some decisions that need to be taken at the level of the nation state as well. And maybe at a global level, we have to talk about what kinds of public goods we need for democracies to flourish. Because what we're seeing right now is the opposite, that democracies are coming apart and that public goods are also dwindling.
In the last chapter of the abstract that I was reading, it really talked about, I guess, 3 potential scenarios, like an ethno-nationalist relapse, social democratic renaissance, and a global rescaling of political systems. Is there one of those 3 that you think is the most likely, or that the world and different governments seem to be heading towards?
So maybe I should explain those scenarios first a little bit. So the idea is you can provide or you can create legitimacy through these different mechanisms: identity, institutions, indifference. So either you provide indifference somehow through cheap credit or so, or cheap goods, and then things are fine, perhaps for a while, or you fix institutions. So you have electoral reform or other types of reform. You provide certain public goods again, or something like this. So the state basically creates an output that makes it legitimate. And the third option is to change the demos, so the identity. And I think this is what we're seeing in many cases, is simply that we have a range of illiberal, authoritarian, or proto-authoritarian leaders, such as Trump and others, who are saying, well, the state isn't really delivering, and it's not delivering for the true demos, for the true people. We should be focusing on white male Americans, right? So this is the revanchism of and the paternalistic and racist revanchism of these illiberals. It's basically saying the demos isn't multicultural, isn't multiracial or multi-ethnic, but we should focus just on this small in-group, another way. So that's the first scenario, right? So focusing instead of on a civic nationalism, open-ended nationalism, rather a turn towards ethno-nationalism. And oftentimes this is done through fear. Right? The foreigners are taking everything away. We should be closing down the borders. The state is giving out handouts to people who don't deserve it and who don't pay taxes. That's the kind of scenario. And we're seeing a lot of that right now. And if Trump is going to win the election again, remains to be seen at this point. But this is it's a realistic scenario that we see this happening in many different places up to a certain point. The second scenario is that of reinforcing the social welfare state. That's what we're trying to argue, and we're thinking a little bit in the book about Biden, and he has been trying to offer a range of public goods again. I mean, he's invested massively in infrastructure, in particular through the IRA, but also the CHIPS Act, so semiconductors, and so there's kind of infrastructures and also education, and the transition towards a sustainable economy were attempts by Biden, I think, to reinvent this idea of the social welfare state and update it for the 21st century. Only problem seems to be that these investments are long-term. So much of what Biden has invested through his administration will only cause effects in 10 or 20 years down the road. And it seems like he's struggling with a couple of other issues right now. And so the question remains, there seems to be a disconnect between what he needs to do to be reelected within 4 years and what needs to be done on a larger temporal framework. And so, so certainly Biden is struggling, and other social democratic parties and leaders are also struggling. And the third question we're asking, which is a little bit utopian, is this idea of rescaling. So the question is, what is it that we actually need to do at the national level? We are seeing renationalization, focus on the national state. Seems to be important after all, even though for a long time people have argued that globalization is hollowing out the nation state, making it irrelevant and incapable to actually address many things. Well, we're seeing actually the national state is quite important, so we have to think about it. Maybe there are certain things that need to be addressed at other scales than the national. So when we're thinking of climate change, for example, or security questions, global security questions, they seem to need some kind of an institutional solution beyond the nation state at the global level. For the last 20, 30 years, this has just all been talked about as global governance in very vague terms. And oftentimes there is no accountability, or not sufficient accountability, and no democratic accountability. So maybe we have to start thinking about how we can build institutions at the global scale that are also democratically responsive to citizens. And that's a major project that people have to think about. Then there's, of course, the fear of world government. So it should be maybe a federal structure that concentrates as little power as possible at the top. So this is exactly the kinds of debates that we would like to, to see happening. Maybe some of the things that we need as societies, as individuals, need to happen at the local scale. So sometimes people argue that cities are somehow closer to what citizens need on the ground, and maybe responsiveness can be ensured at the local level. And maybe there are some goods on the ground, streets, perhaps some education systems or care systems that need to be organized there. So that's exactly the kind of discussion that we're trying to start there.